So is it possible for, two or three people like us to have a really good idea and do something that does transform our world? I suspect that still can happen. It's different. And certainly at the time I was in, early days of Unix, the world was smaller and simpler in the computing world. And so it's probably easier and it was more low-hanging fruit that overused it before. But I suspect that there's still opportunities like that.
Hey there, welcome to Book Overflows, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toops. How's it going, Nathan?
Going great. Hey, everybody.
Well, we have a very special episode for you today. Today, we are excited to offer, once again, another interview with Brian Kernighan. Brian Kernighan is a legend. He is one of the primary inventors of Unix. He's the director of CS undergrad studies at Princeton. If you've been following the podcast, you know him. And we read his book recently, Unix, a History and a Memoir. And he was kind enough to come back on the podcast to chat with us about it. Nathan, what can our listeners expect?
Delightful as always. I think we were able to dig into some of the areas of the book that we found interesting and get some elaboration. It was really just nice to hear Brian's insights on Unix, its influence on the world, and give us a glimpse of Bell Labs and see, what was so unique about that environment and the time that allowed something like Unix to even come to be.
Yeah, Brian is a class act. I think we've said it before, but if I were even 1/10 as accomplished as him, my ego would be the size of the moon. And so to talk to someone who is just so humble, so brilliant, and such a force in our industry really is a huge honor for us, and we're excited to present it to you. So please stick around for the entire interview. This is Brian Kernighan as he reflects on his book, Unix, a History and a Memoir. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Brian. We loved the book, Unix, a History and a Memoir, and we love that you recommended it to us, and we're so happy to get to talk to you again about it. It really is a pleasure to have you on.
That's great for me to be here. It's fun to be back with you guys again. And of course, you have to be suspicious of an author who recommends his own book.
No, it was fantastic. And I think we talked about having read it, and we encouraged our audience during our episode to go and check out our first interview with you, because it was really cool to read a book, because it's a very personal book. It's obviously about you. It's about your career, and to not read it like this is just some random guy who wrote this, but I'm like, no, this is Brian. He's our buddy. He came on the podcast. And so it was a lot of fun. Talk to us a bit about why you decided to write Unix, a History and a Memoir. We usually like our authors kind of describe the industry at the time they wrote the book, but you wrote this book about the industry at a very different time from when you wrote it. So what prompted you to write the book?
Basically, I think it came about because Bell Labs had decided that they wanted to do a 50th anniversary celebration of the creation of Unix. And so Ken Thompson did, I guess, the first thing that you would call Unix in 1969. And so the labs had scheduled this gathering for late October, November, something like that in 2019. And so I had a fair amount of early warning about that. And I was going to be on vacation in England for basically the whole summer, and figured I'd have a fair amount of spare time to work on a book. And so I basically wrote the whole thing in kind of 2 months while I was traveling to England, wandering around there, but totally on vacation, and then cleaned it up. And through the miracle of self-publication through Amazon, I was able to actually get the thing just barely in time for the Bell Labs gathering.
Well, we really enjoyed it. There's so much to talk about with this. Maybe we can start with Bell Labs. You mention in the book that one of the reasons Bell Labs could kind of exist was because it was Bell was a monopoly and had these steady monopoly profits, which eliminated a lot of financial incentive from Bell Labs churning out something that could make money right now. Do you think there's anywhere that still exists like that today for a software engineer to work at?
I honestly don't know enough about it. I think that the reason Bell Labs the world was extremely different in, let's call it 50 years ago or something like that. And as you say, AT&T had pretty much monopoly. I think it probably covered 85 or 90% of the country and provided telephone service, both local and long distance for that, and also did their own manufacturing of equipment and so on. So it was a big deal. It was certainly the largest corporation in the country and had most employees and so on. So that meant that they could do a lot, and there was no competition, and they didn't have to worry about things like quarterly revenue targets or anything like that. There was a sort of a quid pro quo. They were provided this monopoly service, but in return for that, they could only charge a certain amount. They were a regulated monopoly, and that meant that they could only get a certain amount of a rate of return on their investments. So very steady income flow. They knew basically how much was going to come in every month or every year or something like that. And so that meant that they could take a very long-term view of things. You didn't have this, well, what are you going to do this quarter kind of mentality that shows up. And there was no, well, we got to make the numbers come out right for Wall Street. So they could concentrate actually on providing pretty good telephone service for everybody and figuring out how to improve that telephone service over time. And so that's the genesis of Bell Labs. Back in roughly 1925, AT&T decided that they needed a research operation that would kind of keep up with communications, provide new technology and of all sorts to continue to improve the service that they were providing. And so that was kind of the quid pro quo. You give us a sort of guaranteed revenue stream, and in return, we will give you continually improving telephone service.
One of the things that struck me in the book is I'd known about Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. That was sort of my top level understanding of Unix and their contributions to it. But you introduced a whole cast of characters that I had never had introductions to, Hamming being one of them, and then also Doug McIlroy, which I knew he wrote some of the tools that I'd been using and was involved with Unix philosophy. But I think he kind of came to me as a sort of star player that I didn't realize what a sort of gluing a bunch of ideas together. I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit on the characters not the characters, the real people that worked on Unix that maybe the larger audience doesn't know played such an important role.
Right. Yeah, and in some ways, characters is true, as with many groups of people. There were certain unusual folks among them. I think Doug, I would single out as being the unsung hero of the whole thing. He's not as visible as Ken and Dennis, but I think without his combination of exceptional intelligence and guidance and being just an absolutely first-rate user of everything, the kind of user who tries stuff and then tells you what it could be improved, how would it be better in some way. And Doug did that probably at the expense of making himself better known for the Unix group and lots of other folks at Bell Labs. He did that essentially for his entire career there. I was lucky enough to wind up interning for him in my first summer at Bell Labs, so I got to know him well. At that point, he was the outside reader on my PhD thesis, and I didn't write very well, and he improved my writing enormously by just scribbling all right, okay. And that was a role he served for a very large number of people at the labs. He was sort of the first critic of everything, and I think that showed up in the quality of the software that was developed. He was a sounding board, he was a user, and it also showed up strongly in the things that we wrote about what we were doing. And I think part of the reason Unix and all of the things that went with it worked so well was there was a big contribution from Doug's ability to improve people's life, so that what we did was described well as well, working well. So I think Doug in that sense would be the unsung person who didn't get as much recognition as path you deserve.
So
Kind of the obvious one.
yeah, that's really interesting. I think the other thing that came out of this, right, is that you really set the frame of the Bell Labs had this sort of bad taste in their mouth after they're involved with Multics, and it didn't. It became this very complex beast that I don't think ever really met its goals as a project. And the sort of counterexample of this was Unix emerged, and it was very incremental. Like it was just shipping these little interesting ideas that just built on it and grew this community over time within Bell Labs. What was that like? Was that a conscious thing of saying like we're purposefully designing and building it this way as a antithesis to Multics, or was this just something that was a part of the Bell Labs culture in general?
I think it was the sort of simplicity, the find the right generalizations and so on that was characteristic of Unix. I would say a big part of that was Ken Thompson. He had this taste for minimal mechanisms. He had a way of cutting through and finding the general thing that would cover a bunch of special cases so that you had a single mechanism that worked well rather than a bunch of mechanisms that didn't quite work well. The file system in Unix is a nice example of that. Very straightforward, including that hierarchical file system. It wasn't that people didn't know about hierarchical file systems, but the Unix one was, I would say, a masterpiece of finding the right place in the design space. You could argue that the same thing was true of languages, and in particular C. Get a nice combination. And Dennis had that, I think, that same kind of taste for what's the simplest thing that will do the job, but isn't too simple. And so that combination, particularly with those two, and then add in Doug as somebody who would criticize stuff and use it, probe for the weak spots, suggest ways to make it better. I think that combination led to a lot of things which were not nearly as big and complicated as alternatives, certainly nothing like what Multics was, and at the same time actually worked extremely well. And because they weren't very big, it was feasible for actual mortals to create them. And Ken is probably the best programmer I've ever encountered. He had a knack for getting an awful lot out of a relatively few line code. Of course, the other thing to keep in mind is this is a very constrained environment. You go back 50 years, computers were kind of wimpy compared to what we have today. They weren't very fast, and especially didn't have very much memory. And so that combination meant that to get things done, you really had to think cleanly and then implement cautiously, carefully to make it all work.
One thing I really enjoyed about the book was just understanding what made Unix so revolutionary at the time. It's one of those, I mentioned on this podcast quite a few times, the kind of like that trope where the idea of like Seinfeld isn't funny because you watch Seinfeld 30 years later and say, what's the big deal? And people don't realize it was so revolutionary at the time. And it's kind of like Unix. So it's formed the backbone of all modern computing that you kind of go like, what's the big deal? And so reading about like, and it's dumb, like this book is the book that made pipes click for me. Like I'd used pipes before, but I was like, oh, like I finally get it now. And I get why this is such a big deal. Things like a file, not being very opinionated on what a file is. A file is just a sequence of bytes. I don't remember what operating system you compared it to exactly, but you talked in the book about how a certain operating system where if you wanted to create a directory, you had to fill out a form with like 12 different inputs or something like that. And how Unix isn't very opinionated on directory structure. It can be somewhat arbitrary. And because all of this stuff has just been baked into all modern computing, I think we take it for granted. And I guess something I was curious about is there are some inventions in human history you can kind of look at like a grim example would be like the atom bomb, or you can say like Oppenheimer is the father of the bomb, but really there were lots of people in lots of different countries all driving towards that goal. And if he hadn't built it, odds are someone else would have. In some ways, is Unix like that? Is Unix, do you think if Bell Labs hadn't invented Unix, someone else would have? Because it's just the ideal computing structure? Or do you think it really is just this kernel of an idea that started at Bell Labs, and then just by, the nature of how strong it is, and then the happenstance of distributing it to universities, that, I guess, is there a reality where computing does look very different because Ken Thompson and you guys at Bell Labs don't create Unix?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carter. I hate to say it, I don't know the answer either. Alternative histories. There are some things you think probably somebody would have invented it anyway. And atomic bombs maybe so, because it was clear there were paths there. Operating systems, not nearly so clear. The operating systems of the time were manufacturer systems like DEC, which made the early computers, had their own operating systems, and they were fairly clunky and kind of irregular, and they were totally under control of DEC. And so they were not very useful. Multics had a lot of good ideas, but it was too big. There's a nice example, I think, of the second system effect, where, the first system, CTSS, was really neat, but didn't do things that you might want. Multics was going to improve on every aspect of it, and it was too big, too complicated, ahead of time in some sense. And finding the simplifications that made this all work, that I think was kind of maybe unique, maybe a one-shot, maybe it would have wound up differently. I honestly don't know. I mean, you mentioned things like the fact that the system is agnostic about the contents of files. That was not the way it worked with IBM operating systems of the time. IBM operating systems for big mainframes, which had the notion that if a file had a type, that type was part of the file system. And the file system determined the legitimacy of what was in the file as opposed to user programs. And so that great simplification. And I don't know whether that would have been seen as clearly and cleanly by somebody. Eventually it would have, I'm sure. But would it have come together with some of the other simplifications to make a base that was as neat and then ultimately extensible? I don't know. It's a good question.
We're certainly grateful that you all invented Unix and just how revolutionary it's been. Well, one of my favorite little takeaways from the book is talking about how Unix proliferated and how it was given out to universities for, I can't remember if it was free or if the licensing fee was very low, but that students would work with it at universities. Then they'd go to their professional jobs and be like, what do you mean we don't have Unix? Like, you're kidding me. We've got to use this. Do you see, what's the relationship between that and kind of like modern open source software? And maybe what I'm trying to get at is, I know that Bell Labs had a hard time monetizing Unix, but in some ways it's almost like maybe if Bell Labs had been able to monetize it more successfully, it wouldn't have been so as popular as it is today. I guess, do you have any thoughts on kind of the contention between successfully monetizing a product, but then also achieving wide distribution with it?
Yeah. So there's a bunch of things going on there. At the time that Unix was done, because AT&T was a regulated public monopoly, it was not allowed to be in businesses that were not telephony. Creating operating systems and selling them for money was not telephony. And so AT&T couldn't sell it. But what they could do was license it under pretty generous terms to universities, other educational operations. And it was basically a nuisance fee for media. You got a 9-track tape and they charged you something for that. There was a period when you could actually license it for, I don't know, $20,000 or something like that for commercial use, but it wasn't a profit center in any sense. And because AT&T could not at the time be in the business of selling software. Now that changed in, let's call it the early 80s, one of the consent decree kind of things that break up the Bell system activities. And at that point, AT&T tried to get into the business of selling systems and trying to get, in particular, selling Unix and supporting software. And they did that, but I'm not sure it was a very successful operation. And in fact, there was the bifurcation between AT&T's System 5 and Berkeley distribution Unix, which was basically, memory gets dim here under more or less the old terms of engagement, and Berkeley rewrote enough of the software that it was no longer covered by AT&T license. There was an enormous amount of legal flap back and forth as AT&T sued Berkeley, and people fought it out in court. And I think that split actually slowed down the development of Unix and left kind of residual problems for quite some while. So, basically fragmented versions. So I think selling software was not something that AT&T was actually very good at. And so is there a parallel to today's open source kinds of things? Well, open source, think of what we use, the open source software that we use. Compilers for pick your language. There are very few compilers, I would say, that aren't open source in some sense. So companies don't make money selling compilers. Operating systems, well, gee, I mean, there's Linux, and then there's stuff from Windows. Microsoft kind of Windows, this, that, and the other, which is a revenue stream for Microsoft, but probably many of the people we're talking to here not relevant in some sense. There's maybe parallels. You do something useful and you can get it out there and get a lot of people using it. Maybe you can make money, but I think fundamentally you don't make it on the software itself. You make it on the ancillary things, support, maybe premium versions of something or some kinds of software. But for core things, I don't think you make money on the software. Specific applications, different thing entirely. Like Adobe makes money on Photoshop and lots of other things like that. Absolutely. And I'm sure Microsoft makes money on Office.
One of the things that struck me in the book was sort of, the beginnings of this idea were in place. There's the famous story of Ken Thompson's wife and child going to visit family, and he had this 3-week window that he kind of got this MVP of file system and some other core pieces of the operating system in place. And then I think after that, there was this request for a PDP-10 that was rejected, and the group had to get scrappy about, it seemed like almost being useful in another domain. It was sort of brought in early on, and it was really fascinating that to start developing Unix, you ended up reaching out to this other division in the company, getting a PDP-11, so that they could do streamline their patent application process. This was a whole piece of the history that I had no idea about, and it put a smile on my face because I was like, oh, the team had to get really creative around document processing, and that seems to have been a really big driver in general. I would love to hear more about those details, or how did the team come to this conclusion of oh, well, maybe we'll go help this other team over here to work on Unix.
Yeah, the PDP-10, at the time the PDP-10 was big iron. It was, a $500,000 machine, and the management at Bell Labs had been badly bitten by the Multics experience. They pulled out of that after sort of, call it 3 years. It was clear that Multics was not going to provide the service that had promised in a time frame that would be useful to Bell Labs. And so Bell Labs pulled out of it. And that left Ken and Dennis and 3 or 4 or 5 other people bereft. I mean, they'd gotten used to a nice computing environment. They were really interested in building good operating systems, all related software, and no venue for doing that. And so they lobbied for a PDP-10, give me $500,000 to build an operating system. And management said, no, we've been there and we don't want to do that anymore. So that was the time first when Ken found this PDP-7 that basically wasn't being used and did that kind of 3-week experiment. And that was promising enough to encourage other work. And then the PDP-10 request got scaled down to PDP-11, which is just a year, I guess it would call it 1970, 71, something like that. And that was about a 10th price. So that's $50,000, let's say. And so that's more manageable, but you still have to get that money from somewhere. And so there were several people in the Unix group, a group that was coalescing around this kind of thing, who were interested in document preparation in one way or another. And so that somebody in that group, and I think it was probably Joe Santa, basically connected with the Bell Labs patent operation, and Bell Labs turned out a lot of patent applications, sort of one a day. And patent applications had to have a specific format, like line numbers. And the word processing systems of the time didn't do that. And so Osana basically said, well, we'll provide a system that will let you type patent applications into a computer, and we'll put line numbers on the documents for you. And that was enough to encourage somebody to somehow the $50,000 materialized, get a machine. And so for a while, there were two computers. There was one computer that was used in the daytime by the patent department to produce patent applications. And then in the evening, it was used for Unix software development, so that it was kind of you get it in the morning and I get it in the evening kind of operation for doing that. And that was sufficiently successful that, and it became easier to get more later. The application, the document preparation, I think was kind of an application for a number of people, including me. I mean, I found it intriguing. When I was a grad student, I wrote a program to do simple-minded formatting, basically, just flow the words from an input onto the page and print them neatly with lines that were this long. And I wrote that program to print my thesis. Now, I wrote it in Fortran, and it was on punch cards. Kind of antiquated technology, but this was 1968, so it's okay. But I was interested in that kind of thing. Doug McIlroy was interested, Joe Santa was interested, and there were several others. And so there was a lot of activity in that area. And it turned out that was another one of these things which was, in hindsight, a virtue, because it meant that as we wrote documentation of whatever sort, we could produce it ourselves. We didn't have to go, for example, to a print shop, or we didn't have to go to get people to type it. And that meant that we could refine it and make it better. And the quality was higher because of the rapid feedback cycle, as well as the critical comments from people like Doug.
That's a great segue into the rapid feedback piece. The other thing that really struck me in this book was the userland development cycles, right? So one of the things it seems that Unix, and of course most of my interaction with Unix-like systems are in Linux, is the composability of command line tools and using the Unix philosophy. And it feels like this inspired a bunch of work because all of you could wrap your heads around this idea that, oh, well, I have standard in and standard out and standard error. I have pipes. It incentivize, and it seems like because of the constraints of memory and other things that pipelining these pieces. What I know, especially with tools like awk that you had built on, which I guess was, did you start building awk because you had this clear vision, or did you start with like, oh, I want to build something in Unix, and this was just an area that you were exploring? Like, what was the motivation behind that?
Well, I think that the motivation for a lot of these things is what you hinted at, that it was easy to compose programs because it started with the idea that you could capture the standard output of a program in a file, and you could redirect the standard input from a file. So that was the basics of it. Pipes came along a little later, but that was a great example of how notation changes the way you do things. It was just a perfect notation. It's like going from Roman numerals to Arabic numbers. I mean, it liberated things. The ability to combine programs was important because the memory on these computers was very small. I mean, the big machines had 64K bytes. And that meant that individual programs couldn't be that big, but it was possible to pipe stuff from one place to another. And so, for example, the document preparation tools that I worked on were separate programs that you combined in a pipeline where each element of the pipeline dealt with some specific kind of tricky material like mathematics or tables or pictures, whatever. And so that was document preparation, but the same kind of I will string things together operation worked pretty well for all kinds of other things. Examples like graph, where you would use graph to grab the output from something and maybe filter, select, and somebody pass it on to some further program. So awk came along somewhat later. It dates roughly from 1977, so we're well into this. Types have been around for a while. The things that made awk go, partly it was a combination of interests of the three people involved. Alejo was very interested in regular expressions, technology for matching patterns. He was the world expert on that at that time, I would say. Peter Weinberger was interested in vaguely database-related things, but report generation and so on. And I'd been fiddling around with how do you manage something that will manipulate numbers and text with equal facility. We had plenty of good tools for text. We had plenty of tools for numbers, but not something that let you mix them. So we thought about that. The other thing that was a critical piece of the operation was the development of language development tools like that. The idea that you could specify the grammar of a language in formal syntax, basically, there's no ENF kind of thing. You could specify the syntax of a language and then hang semantics on that and build yourself a parser for a language very, very easily. And you didn't have to be an expert on parsing to do it. You could be just somebody who could say, well, here's the rules for grammar. So I had used that for a language for doing mathematical typesetting. Think of it as an early precursor of things like LaTeX. So here's a language for specifying mathematics. It's a processor for the document, or in the document preparation type. awk was another example of these, where we had an idea for a language design and sketch out and implement very quickly the parser for the language, and then hang semantics on it. And in fact, I don't remember how long we talked about design of awk, but it probably wasn't very long. This was Al and Peter and I. And we happened to be at the time, I think, in adjacent offices. So we talked about it and came up with a grammar or something like that. And literally, Peter went away over a weekend and created it. Because, why not? He's a good programmer, and here's a tool that makes it easy to do the grammar. I think we used Lex, the lexical analyzer generator, to do the syntactic level, the bottom level token parsing as well. So we're using the tools to build a new tool, which then it's, I don't know if you call it incestuous or what, but it certainly made it possible to do things rather quickly. And of course, it was a lot of fun.
That's great. I was talking to some of the engineers on my team. I just joined a new team about a month ago, and he had a question. He said his first real awakening on associative arrays happened from his use of awk. And he was curious about that as a concept in awk, and where that had kind of come into play, because he said it's still one of the most powerful concepts in programming to him today.
Yeah. So I share that feeling that it's just an astonishingly effective data structure. It's sort of like it's the one data structure to have if you're only having one, right? I mean, it's just because you can do everything with associative arrays. I think technically maybe the first place where they showed up, at least in the sort of Bell Labs chain, was they were in Snobol, which was a very early string processing kind of language, a language which I never used. But it was in the air. Doug McIlroy certainly knew about Snobol intimately. And I don't know which among of us, Alan, Peter, and I came up with we will use associative arrays and not. It's so much in the air that it's probably natural. And it was kind of thing that was being described in the technical literature of the time. If you look at, there would be papers occasionally in Communications DHCM, which would talk about, well, you want to do hash tables, you use open hashing or closed hashing and things like that. And at some point, became totally clear that this is actually straightforward. There's a certain amount of engineering to make it work well. Closed hashing makes no sense. Open hashing is fine. We need dynamic allocation. Well, Doug McIlroy is the world expert on MLR. So all the piece parts were just sitting there. And so it became the data structure in and of course, it's in all programming languages in some form or another at this point. Or if it isn't, it's a very easy exercise to build it.
Something I was thinking about as I was reading the book is that Bell Labs obviously is hiring the best of the best, but at the end of the day, Bell Labs was a relatively small team, somewhat of a scrappy operation. And out of it emerges Unix, which obviously transforms the world. I think a lot of software engineers, what draws them about the field is the idea that they can have a transformational impact. But when we look at kind of the big ideas that have changed the world recently, well, I guess what I'm thinking about right now is like AI and like large language models, right? And the idea that could come out of like a somewhat scrappy operation, I don't know how possible that is. These models cost billions of dollars to train. And, there's a reason that it's been a big benefit to a lot of the big incumbent businesses. Do you think that as computing has grown more complex and we just kind of are sitting on top of abstraction after abstraction after abstraction, do you think there's still potential for an idea like Unix to emerge from a relatively small, scrappy group?
I think so. For small is relative in some sense. Remember, Unix was developed in the Computing Science Research Center at Bell Labs, which had, at the time I was there early on, call it 25 or 30 people, but it was buried in a research operation which had something like 3,000 PhDs, mostly in one building. It was a big operation in that sense, but it was covering an enormous spectrum of research activities. And then that was part of a much larger development organization, which was taking research ideas and whatever, making things that were actually to be used. And then that was buried in over 1 million person company that was providing phone service. So small, it depends where you slice this. High. However, your basic point, I think, is still pretty relevant in a way. If you look at, and I will tell you right up front, I am not an AI person, and nor do I do large language models in any meaningful way. You're right. Parts of that require enormous resources, in particular training, collecting the data, doing the training, and so on to create a model. And so lots and lots of people doing that. There's one of the papers that I saw on It was one of the Google models, had close to 1,000 co-authors, which just bizarre.
Oh, wow.
And so that's part of it. The fundamental ideas in that rather smaller. So, for example, Jeff Hinton, who just won a Nobel Prize for his contributions to machine learning, among other things, even though it was prized in physics, also won the Turing Award a few years earlier with 2 other people, and for the development of machine learning techniques, particularly deep learning kinds of things. And that's an oldish idea, but it's a relatively small number of people associated with it. And then the current deep learning things, again, the transformer model, that comes out of, I think, of Google, and a fairly small number of people involved on that, in the sense of who had the idea, and then a lot of people to make it work at scale. So is it possible for, 2 or 3 people like us to have a really good idea and do something that does transform our world? I suspect that still can happen. It's different. And certainly at the time I was in, early days of Unix, the world was smaller and simpler in the computing world. And so it's probably easier. There was more low-hanging fruit that overused it before. But I suspect that there's still opportunities like that. And maybe they are at the boundaries between things, places where you bring an expertise from one field to problem domain that hasn't had that kind of expertise applied to it yet. Maybe get something from that. So I think, yeah, opportunity. Specific advice? No, don't take it from me. I have none.
I like the idea of the three of us coming up with an idea.
Yeah,
We got about 30 minutes left on this recording,
Go for
so
it.
I'm optimistic by the end of this we'll have something that changes the future of computing. Then maybe what I'm trying to think, because I think you bring up some great points, right? Where it's like, well, what we know as ChatGPT today has obviously taken billions of dollars and hundreds of engineers to get up and running, but the initial idea, the kernel, does come out of somewhere smaller. Then what did it feel like when you were building Unix? Did you know that this would transform computing, or did it? I guess, yeah. What does it feel? What did it feel like in the moment working on something that would eventually form the basis of pretty much most modern operating systems?
Yeah, I think at the time there was, at least not from my standpoint, I have a feeling not from others as well, that this would have anything like the effect that it has had. So no, we did not see the future very clearly at all. There's that famous line from, I think it's the second edition manual, that says the number of systems has grown to 10 with more expected, right? And I remember once back, and this dates the story, of course, but time when the New York Times published classified advertisements for things like programmers, oddly enough. And I found an advertisement that somebody wanted a C programmer or work on Unix or something like that in the New York Times classified advertising. And I remember saying to Dennis, we've arrived. So,
Well,
no, we did not. Certainly not me, and I suspect not most people predicted that future even remotely.
This is good. This is going to make me feel optimistic about any project I work on.
Yeah.
One of the things that came from this book that was interesting to me is I don't think I had really wrapped my head around the time frame. Like, I didn't realize how early some of the ideas of Unix began. And then while I did have an awareness of Plan 9, I didn't realize where, if there's a sort of spiritual successor to some of the core ideas, what an important role Plan 9 was in that, especially when folks like Rob Pike start becoming involved. And while I think Plan 9 maybe didn't get the mind share of how computing works directly, it seems like it had a huge impact indirectly, specifically with projects that came out of Plan 9. I would love to know more about, like, what did you feel might happen with Plan 9 and how did that surprise you?
Yeah, so I was peripherally involved at best, and mostly not at all, with Plan 9. The same cast of characters in most respects, but I was not as involved. The idea with when Unix had become basically a commercial system, in spite of what we said earlier about not being able to sell software, Unix, the development in the sort of development area of AT&T devoted to System 5 and things like that was sort of driving the direction of the system and putting constraints on it that made it harder for folks in research to be involved, keep interested, and in any sense steer the operation. And so basically AT&T's System 5 went off in its own direction. The research folks kind of felt, I think, that they had milked as much as they could on mainstream, mainline Unix. And so the internal version stopped at version 10, something like that. But the folks who were still interested in such matters had, as always, things, now we understand it better, perhaps we could do a better version of the system that would address some of those things. And so Plan 9, I think, came out of that. It was largely Ken Thompson, Rob Pike, and I guess Phil Winterbottom. And the idea was, again, take some of the ideas that work well in Unix and see if you could generalize them in some sense. So one of the ideas that worked well in Unix was that different things could be represented as file systems. So file system, in the sense of organizing a disk, but you could also have file system devices work in the file system. So that's another example. processes became part of the file system. And so Plan 9 pushed that part very hard, and essentially all resources became file systems. So Windows became file systems, shell environment became file systems. And so you had a uniform mechanism of file system stuff that Tim had invented used before, that accessing all kinds of different resources. So that was one idea. Another thing that they wanted to do was really do portability well, so you could write code once and it really would run everywhere. Twice every compiling. Networking had come along. Unix predates networking in modern sense, but by the time Plan 9 was going on, networking was there. The internet was starting to become part of life, not quite pretty close. And some of the tools were kind of crufty. The libraries had awkwardnesses, just all kinds of things. So let's see if we can clean it up. So that was Plan 9, and you take 3 or 4 or 5 really, really, really talented people and let them go with it. So that was the good news. I think the bad news, in some sense, was because it was, in fact, completely new. You take the good ideas, but lots of things were new. So there were new libraries, particular I/O libraries, kind of other things. There wasn't really a good bridge between existing Unix systems and their software, which everybody depended on, and Plan 9 and its better ideas, but now you had to port software. And for many people, and I would include myself, it was just too much trouble. I had a useful program, but to move it to Plan 9, I had to, in effect, rewrite parts of it. And the IO systems were different. Make was replaced by Look, and just on and on and on. And it was too much overhead unless you were deeply interested. There were people who made heroic efforts to bridge this gap in one way or another, providing libraries that would implement the existing standard library stuff on Plan 9, rewriting tools and so on. But it was too much of an uphill struggle for, I think, a lot of people, and that's probably part of the reason why Plan 9 didn't take on. I think the biggest single thing that Plan 9 did was, in terms of effect on the world, was the invention by Ken and Rob of UTF-8. And, everything else is down in the noise in my mind in comparison to that, because that's the way you exchange information. And that was done by those two guys as hey, this is how we could handle all the characters known to mankind in our operating system. A transfer format for Unicode. So Unicode done somewhere else, perfect, good, wonderful idea, and lots and lots of work to make it work. Here's the transfer form, the way in which you're transferring Unicode from one place to another efficiently and working perfectly with the ASCII character set, which is the bulk of the data for most parts, certainly locally and any other parts of the world. So I think that's the idea from Plan 9. The idea that almost anything could be a file system, I think that's very nice. Philosophical, it's neat. Maybe not as much in effect in the real world.
Yeah. And I think it was maybe a computer file episode when I first really understood the elegance of UTF-8. It's incredibly clever and efficient. And I think, it really shows that sort of, I guess, maybe the playfulness approach that kind of came out of the Bell Labs way of thinking about problem solving. We'll add a link in the description to this episode because I think it's worth anyone who's curious. UTF-8's a big deal, and I think it was Go that had UTF-8 of course was first class in that how strings work, and so I have a deep appreciation because when I came from a programming language like Python where we had to make a bunch of you run into issues where the character sets were not assumed to be UTF-8 and it would get really weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky to get right because internally you really want something like 32-bit characters, let's say. That's probably good enough, but externally that's not the right way to do it. And so keeping track of which one of those you're in and doing well continues to be a puzzlement.
Yeah. Cool.
Forgive me for a bit of a tortured metaphor here. But I'm a big fan of American history, particularly presidential history. And there's a great podcast by the Washington Post. Lillian Cunningham hosts it, called Presidential. It was about 8 years ago, where each episode focused on a different president. And the Jimmy Carter episode was really interesting because he's still living today, and obviously was back then. But it started off, he became president when he was young-ish, in his 50s. And he was still, at this time, he's in his 90s, and when the podcast was recorded, he's teaching Sunday school. And so it started off with a recording of him at a Sunday school class. And it was really funny because people come from all over to go to a Sunday school in Georgia. And so he'd be like, "Where are you from?" They're like, "Oh, Florida." He's like, "Oh yeah, I lived in Florida for a bit." Someone's like, he's like, "Where are you from?" He's like, "Iowa." Like, "Oh yeah, I lived in Iowa for a bit." And people are talking about where they're from. He's like, "Yeah, I lived in Iowa. I lived in Nebraska. I lived in Maine. I lived in Georgia. I've lived all over the place." Then he gets to the next person. He says, "Where are you from?" And he says, "Washington, D.C." And he says, "Oh, yeah, I lived there too." And he had just totally forgotten. And I think about Jimmy Carter in that way, where he became president. This is obviously the crowning achievement of his life, and has gone on to live for another 50 years post that. And I think about that and how strange that must be in some way. Like, I mean, Unix is obviously the biggest, most influential thing you worked on, and you worked on it, 40, 50 years ago. What is it like having a career after that? Does, like, I don't want to diminish what you've done. Obviously, you've had a very prolific career, but in some ways, is everything kind of pale in comparison, or is it just kind of old hat at that point? I don't even know what it would be like.
Well, that's kind of an intriguing question, I guess. It's interesting how successful Unix has been. Some of that success is actually due to follow-ons. I would say Linux is just an absolutely major contribution on its own, both from Torvalds originally and then from all of the folks who've kept in and done useful things on that. So they built on something solid, but they built something really good on top of that. So I think that's pretty relevant. For me, I think realistically, after, call it 25 years at Bell Labs, starting roughly at the time when Unix started, after 25 years, things are getting, oh, geez, I've done this for a long time at this point. And so the company has changed, the universe around it has changed, the people have evolved, and all this kind of stuff. And so I can, truth be told, by the mid-90s, I was getting a little restless. And so when I had a chance finally to go to university around 2000, so I went to Princeton, and that's a different kind of operation entirely, and it's a different kind of fun. And so I, call it a second career or, second childhood. I don't know what you want to call it, but it's enormous fun to do that. And so I can look back on the Unix stuff, and of course I can impose my dinosaur-like views of things on the kids in my classes, which I do all too often, I guess, and old war stories and things like that. But at the same time, university is a good place to hang out as well. And given the modern corporate world, university might actually be a better place to hang out in some ways, because I can kind of do what I want, and I'm surrounded by this always renewable resource of new kids coming in, plus great adults who hang out here as well. So in that sense, it's kind of good. And so I don't have to look back on Unix with regret or anything else. Just saying, that was a lot of fun at the time. Surprised how much effect it's had on things. But okay, there's still lots to be done.
You ever lean over your students' shoulders when they're working in a terminal and be like, "Hey, you see that? I invented that."
No.
So that's actually a really good tie into one of the other things that struck me from the book was the level of humility and collaboration that was especially with Dennis and Ken. It struck me, especially when we get these little snippets of their emails, of how informal or how much they would downplay maybe even their contributions. And it felt like that was a cultural piece of Bell Labs in general.
Yeah, I think it was. I think at every level, certainly in our part of, and many others, people did not, there was not that much interest in status. Nobody had titles internally. It was first name basis everywhere. I think people were very, very generous in giving credit to others or downplaying their own role in things. And, that's good for everybody in a sense. And certainly I was one of the beneficiaries of that right from the very beginning. With people who, contributed a lot, helped out enormously, and didn't say, "Oh, and make sure my name is on the paper," kind of thing. In that sense, was a very cooperative environment with a lot of people who were modest about their contribution.
I would love to know what are your favorite enduring ideas that have come out of the Unix work, and what do you still see sort of how its long-term influence moving forward?
There's some specific ideas like hype, which I think we hinted at earlier. One of those things. Wow, I mean that just it's such a simple idea in retrospect, and it changes the way you think about all kinds of things. It changes the implementation of programs literally overnight. So that, if you like, a specific instance. I think the idea of a programmable shell, which wasn't really around that much, and it's the thing you type at, but you can also use it as a programming language, and then you can start to, it goes along with that idea, the composition of tools. All of that relied, of course, on the idea that the input and output of these tools tend to be lines of text. And at the time, that was perfectly good. Less clear now that because we have more complicated data representations, and so maybe stuff comes in JSON that's no longer lines of text, or at least the line boundaries are maybe not meaningful in the same way. So you need something different. But those are, I would call, small things, but ideas that stick with me at this point. A larger idea then is that if you're going to do something, start small and see how it goes and grow it up. So I spend time with students here who want to do something complicated with machine learning. They've got some data that they think is interesting, and they want to apply machine learning sledgehammers to it to learn something about it. And part of what I wind up doing is to encourage them to use simple-minded, old-fashioned command line tool. This is my dinosaur mood. To say, what's in your data? Just count stuff. How many of those things are there? Are there ones that look weird? Are there patterns that you see with old-fashioned tools? And so again, as I say, it's probably too much old-style stuff, but command line processing is actually very powerful for looking at data. You should not immediately lead to a pandas data frame or something like that. And so that's me taking something that I was good at 50 years ago and trying to map it into the modern world. And half the time I think that's the right thing to do, and other times, the pandas data frame looks fine, or you get ChatGPT to generate the graph for you, and you don't have to think about it at all. So finding that balance.
I love that. Actually, I still spend a ton of time in the command line, and it was actually a friend of mine, maybe I guess over 20 years ago at this point. He was actually the first person to introduce me to Plan 9, which I know that it was pretty far in at that point, but it had a huge impact when I started thinking about command line tools and composability and doing things that had a permanent impact. And I think that there's a type of work I do on a computer that I always try to think of in that sort of shell first approach. Of course, I do a lot of like automation work, so it is a very nice way of me structuring the things that I'm doing. But it is interesting too, because I'll see folks who immediately reach for like a pandas notebook or something, and that's their scratch pad, where I'll, for me, it's awk and sed and grep and, piping things into each other, JQ, I guess, increasingly with JSON. But it's fascinating, I guess, how many workflows are possible in this environment. And and then how the command line and terminals are still incredibly powerful and incredibly useful today. That's really cool.
I admit totally to bias on this, but you're right.
Well, we loved the book. It's I don't know why. To me, it felt like a Christmas book. I think it's just because we had scheduled to read it around like November-ish, and I was like, oh, this feels like the kind of book you curl up and read on the fire or by the fireplace. And so, for any of our listeners, you're getting it at the right time. I don't think it's actually a Christmas book, but to me, it felt that way. And it really was such a pleasure reading it. We got a lot of mileage last time in the podcast. We asked you what you had been reading or what you would recommend to our listeners. And obviously, you actually recommended two that we picked up on. We read Recoding America by Jennifer Polka, which we really enjoyed. And then we read, obviously, Unix, A History and a Memoir. So you've been a great source of recommendations for us, Brian. Is there anything else you've been reading or that you'd recommend to our audience?
Yeah, I read a lot of books, and I discovered that a lot of them I kind of get partway in and say, no, this isn't going to work for me. Or even I read the whole thing, I forget after a while. There's an advantage if you can read it again. I read one by Nate Silver. Nate Silver is well known.
Oh, I love Nate Silver.
Yeah, right. So he wrote this book called On the Edge, which is basically partly about his career as a professional poker player. And partly about industries that I didn't know much about, like sports betting and so on. And of course, I read it from the perspective of I know enough statistics to know it's a loser's game no matter what, so don't. But some of his stories are kind of interesting. I don't know enough about poker to recognize even the particular variant that played at these high stakes professional games. But the book itself, I thought, was kind of interesting, and so you could conceivably add that one to your collection. Other one, there was a book that I read that I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm trying to think what the name of it was. Yes, it is a book called Origin Story, and it's by Howard Markel, Markel, and it's about the trials of Charles Darwin. Sort of what happened when Darwin origin of species actually out. And there's this famous exchange between Thomas Huxley and Samuel Wilberforce that Wilberforce was a bishop in the Church of England, and he made this famous remark, well, you wouldn't want to be descended from an ape or something like that. And Huxley made the response that basically, if, being descended from men, it's like you, I would rather be the ape. I think very much more depth than that. And it was,
if I remember, Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog or pit bull or something like this. It was like
bulldog, I think. Yes, bulldog. Exactly. Yeah, exactly that. So this book is all about the things leading up to that and related things. And the reason, in part of it, that was it fit so well with what I was doing is that I happened to get access to it online the day that my wife and I had visited the Oxford Science Museum, because we were in England in the summer. And that's the place where that discussion between Huxley and Wilberforce took place. And I hadn't realized that. So it was just a nice time. The book itself is extremely well written. And I think well worth reading. Enjoy. It's a good book about history of an important intellectual part of what we do.
Well, fantastic. And thanks so much for that Nate Silver recommendation. I've followed him for a long time with his work at 538. I subscribe to his Substack to get his good analysis of upcoming elections. And I've been wanting to read his book. And so, and so now it's maybe this is the excuse I have to slot into the podcast. And Nate Silver, if you're listening, he's not.
Go for it.
Hey, maybe we can get him on the podcast too. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic, Brian. We can't say enough how much we appreciate you coming on. When you first came on the podcast, I think we had like 200 subscribers. And I was just shocked that you even responded to the email. And so it really was so beneficial for us right at the beginning. And we're happy that we were able to have you back on. We're about at 8,000 or so now. So and obviously your interview was very good for our growth. And so it's fun to have you back on now that we've found our footing a little. And we can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time. Not only this time, but the first time too. It really is such a pleasure chatting with you.
No, this is a blast for me. So as long as it's fun for you guys, this is great.
Oh, this is great. This is exactly. We thought this was always our goal with the podcast. Was we're like, and maybe one day we'll be able to get the authors on. And so we were so pleased that we were able to get that happening sooner. And having you on the podcast gave us a lot of credibility to have some other prominent folks on, like Martin Fowler or John Osterhout. And so it really has been a blast, and you've been a big part of that.
So, well, good.
Well, thanks a ton, Brian. I guess, do you have, obviously the book is Unix, A History and a Memoir. We'll include a link in the description. Please go out and buy it. It's great. It's a relatively short read. We were able to cover it in 1 week. So I recommend to really anyone who's interested, especially if you've been interested after hearing this interview. Brian, anything else you want to plug? You're not really on social media a ton, I don't think.
I don't do that stuff, but I appreciate the plug for the book. So yeah.
There you go.
Buy it. Everybody tell your friends. Good Christmas gift. You got it.
You want to plug Princeton? It's an up and coming university. I'm not sure if most people have heard of it.
Yeah, a small liberal arts college in suburban New Jersey.
Well, that's great. Well, and you can find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io, or just check out the website www.bookoverflow.io. You can find a reading schedule there if you want to keep up with what we're reading next. Nathan does Functionally Imperative. That is his newsletter and interview series with other fascinating creative folk. You can find all the information for that at www.functionallyimperative.com. And yeah, that about takes us home. Again, Brian, we can't thank you enough. This has been such a pleasure for us. And just thanks a ton for stopping by.
Pleasure. Take care, guys. Talk to you again.
See ya.